Welcome everyone to the August meeting of the NPSOT Dallas chapter. Today we have Carol Garrison from the John Bunker Sands Wetland Center. She's here to speak on native plants and their role with municipal water waste reuse. She is a North Texas Master Naturalist. She's a third generation native Texan. She will be celebrating 4 years as an educator at the John Bunker Sands Wetland Center. What promotion did you just get?
I've gone from being an educator to being the education coordinator.
Woo! When she's not teaching or gardening in her front yard, a fabulous front yard, by the way, she is making observations for iNaturalist and breaking records here and there. Woo! Way to go, girl.
Thank you. Thank you.
Her favorite walking area is the Spring Creek Forest near her home in Garland. Without further ado, take it away, my dear.
Well, thank you so much. So I'm really glad to see such a big crowd here, and I'm hoping that there's more than one of you that doesn't really know about John Bunker Sands Wetland Center. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the center itself, the history of the East Fork Water Reuse Project, both natural and man-made wetlands, and then really what the roles of the native plants play at this particular man-made wetland. So I'm going to go ahead and keep my fingers crossed that my screen does what I want it to do, and I can share my screen. All right. Hopefully everybody can see the screen. Cindy, if you can just tell me if you can see it. Beautiful. All right. Well, like I said, I'm a recently promoted education coordinator at the John Bunker Sands Wetland Center, and I'm celebrating my fourth year this week, actually. So it's a fantastic place, and not only is it a location where my personal municipal water is actually being cleaned and polished and returned back into the urban water cycle, it's also where there are an amazing collection of native plants and all the different living creatures that enjoy those plants. So without further ado, let's get started and talk about this particular amazing man-made wetland. All right, so you're probably wondering, first of all, why in the world is this wetland center named after John Bunker Sands? Who is he? To kind of give you a little bit of the history of this place, we're going to go all the way back to the late 70s, all the way through the early 90s. John Bunker Sands, who is a descendant of Caroline Rose Hunt, he was the ranch manager of the property out in Seagaville/Combine. Now, when he managed that property, there was a particular portion of the property that was more prone to flooding and wasn't really good for growing any crops, and it certainly wasn't ideal for cattle. So he, being an avid naturalist himself, and also being an avid duck hunter, decided that the best thing he could do with about 3,000 acres of the property was to convert it into a wetland. He actually hired an environmental agency to come up with a really great footprint for it. And all he had to do was breach the Trinity River and get the water flooded in there. And then he would have himself a fantastic area for all the waterfowl where he and his fellow friends could do a bit of hunting. Now, as you can well imagine, it takes quite a bit of authorization to get a river such as the Trinity River to be breached. And despite his clout in the community, he did not have any success getting Congress to approve to breach the river. And he had to take his plans and he had to shelve them. And unfortunately, he was pretty sure that his idea of a man-made wetland out in Combine was never going to happen. Now, fortunately for this particular project, a few more things happened. So let's get a little bit of a geography lesson just so we can get an idea of exactly what we're talking about. Hopefully everybody can see my little arrow here. We've got the Red River up there dividing Texas and Oklahoma, and there's Lake Texoma. That beautiful little man-made lake or reservoir is Lavon Lake. Down below that is Lake Ray Hubbard. And then we have this beautiful river system that goes all the way through. It starts just south of the Oklahoma-Texas border. And this beautiful river, which is the Trinity River, dumps all the way out in Trinity Bay. Probably as most of you know, the Trinity River is the largest, longest river that's wholly contained in the state of Texas. So we can truly say it's all ours. And when you have a river that's this large, there's no way you're going to be able to breach it and not impact millions of people. So no, John Bunker didn't get the chance to breach the river, but there was more to this story and more partnerships that formed that actually led to the development and the eventual implementation of the largest man-made wetland in the United States. I'm going to highlight one area here. That's the East Fork of the Trinity River. There's obviously 4 forks, and the main stem is what really goes through Dallas. But generally, after we get past the juncture where the East Fork and the main stem join together, that is what the rest of Texans that are south of Dallas refer to as the main stem that goes all the way down into Trinity Bay. So I'm sure everybody's heard of zebra mussels and their relationship with exactly why we find ourselves with a man-made wetland. Zebra mussels are an invasive, undesirable creature. And the main reason why they are undesirable is because they tend to colonize and clump around man-made surfaces, mainly water pipes. The problem with when zebra mussels tend to cluster on these pipes is they decrease the internal diameter of the pipe, which means the volume of water stays the same, the pressure goes up, and that's how we find ourselves with burst water pipes. So from the perspective of all of the entities that manage water within the state, zebra mussels are a serious construction hazard. Aside from that, they are an invasive creature, and so it's actually illegal to transport them across state lines. Now, in 1999, Lake Texoma was diagnosed with an infestation of zebra mussels. Now, to most people, they wouldn't think that that's a really big deal, but to the North Texas Municipal Water District, who is the water district that provides service to many cities and areas going all the way north as far as Anna and up to Frisco, McKinney, and all the way down south of actually where we are in Combine. That water was about 20% of the water that they were using. So overnight, when the zebra mussels were identified in Lake Texoma, the North Texas Municipal Water District found themselves with an overnight loss of about 20% of their water supply because they were used to trucking it in and cleaning it at the Wiley treatment plant. So this made a pretty big concern to the North Texas Municipal Water District, because what are we going to do if you can't use 20% of the water? Well, at the same time, the next big impact on the North Texas Municipal Water District came along, and that was one of the worst droughts in the history of Texas. It started actually in late 1999 and went all the way into 2001. So now you've got a water district that's providing water to millions of people in Texas, and you've got zebra mussels stopping 20% of the water being able to bring down from Lake Texoma, and your own water reservoir, which is Lake Lavon, it's all of a sudden having serious issues because of the drought. And if this wasn't enough to make the water district really reconsider how to treat their municipal water, at the same time, everybody that didn't live in Texas decided to come live in Texas. At that time in 2000, the net population growth to just the North Texas area was 293 people a day. So you've got an increase in population, can't get water for Lake Texoma, and our own reservoir is having serious water problems. And this is when the North Texas Municipal Water District had to make a decision between the two ways to be able to have more water. Number one, build another reservoir, or number two, take some guidance from European models and build a water reuse wetland. Well, they decided to do both. The problem with building a new reservoir is it takes anywhere between 20 and 30 years to complete construction on another reservoir, and it costs billions of dollars. To build a man-made wetland is a fraction of the cost. We're talking between 200 and 300 million. So obviously a far better financial choice, and obviously a lot quicker. Instead of that 20 to 30 years for another reservoir, less than 10 years, and you can have yourself a man-made wetland. So let's get a little bit of, I kind of got some good labels on here to kind of get you a little bit of an orientation. Again, here's Lavon Lake, which is the main reservoir for the North Texas Municipal Water District. Here's Lake Ray Hubbard. That's the main reservoir for the city of Dallas residents. And down here is the East Fork Water Reuse Project. Right here, as you're looking at my arrow, follows down the East Fork of the Trinity River. And so what they decided to do was they decided to find themselves a location where they could put in a water reuse wetland to recapture the water that is going through the municipal system. Now, if you look at this, there's a lot of little symbols going on. I want everybody to look at the little orange triangles. Each one of those orange triangles represents a waste treatment plant. Now, not only am I the education coordinator at the John Bunker Sands Wetland Center, I happen to live in Garland, so I'm also a North Texas Municipal Water District water customer. I live in one of the member cities. So whenever I flush my toilet, my waste is going to travel down and it's going to go into the closest treatment plant, which is right off of Duck Creek. All waste treatment plants are going to clean all of the solids, the things we ought not flush, everything from plastic soldiers to wash rags to wipes. They're going to take all those things out. They're going to break down the solids. They're going to do a bit of flocculation, and they're going to get that product and they're going to turn it from actual wastewater into a product we call effluent. Now, every single one of these waste treatment plants, after they have converted that product into an effluent, they release it back into the water system via the next creek that is closest by. And that's why you're always going to see creeks next to waste treatment plants, because they need to be able to get rid of that effluent and get it into the water system. Now, for me, living in Garland, my nearest waste treatment plant is right off of Duck Creek. So after the waste has been turned into effluent, it's released into Duck Creek. And like all the other creeks in the North Texas area, they are eventually going to flow into the East Fork of the Trinity River. Now, I know that the East Fork of the Trinity River has a lot of bad reputations about how nasty it can be, and it really depends on the season as to how heavy with effluent the river actually is. During very low times of rain, the river can actually be 75 to 90% effluent, and we all know that when we drive past the river. However, during spring and fall rains, the percentage effluent can actually drop down to 50%. So it's not your imagination that the Trinity River does seem to be much more pleasant during rainy season. That's because the effluent is just being diluted by all of the surface water from the rains. So back to the effluent running down Duck Creek after I flushed the toilet. So normally what would happen is effluent would all drain from the creeks into the East Fork of the Trinity River, and that effluent would mix with all the ground rain and eventually just go all the way down into Trinity Bay. Now, this is where this wetland is going to capture that water, because instead of that water going all the way down into the Trinity Bay, the North Texas Municipal Water District, they found themselves a plot of land that was quite close, only about a mile west of the East Fork of the Trinity River. Quite lucky, you say, that they found that, but this is where the first happenstance of great coincidence occurs, because one of the gentlemen that was on the board of directors for the North Texas Municipal Water District at the time, he lived in Combine, Texas, and he drove past the Rosewood Ranch every day. And so he said, you know what, you should contact the Hunt Sands family and see if they would like to partner up and have you use some of the land. The North Texas Municipal Water District actually contacted the same environmental engineers that John Bunker Sands did, which was Allen Plummer and Associates. They drew up the plans and they were able to come up with a partnership to where the land would be leased from Rosewood Ranch to the North Texas Municipal Water District. And the Water District then built the 1,830-acre man-made wetland that you can visit Tuesdays through Saturdays year-round, and where I happen to work. The one part of the agreement on this particular partnership is that a small parcel of land, 1 acre, would be set aside. An educational facility would be installed for educators to teach children and adults wetland ecology, wildlife ecosystems, plant diversity, and bird adaptations. And it was named after John Bunker Sands, who unfortunately died of cancer before he had the chance to see his wetland become reality. So many different partnerships going on here. You've got the Water District, you've got the Sands family, and then you have all of the environmental engineers. So once they were able to get that agreement going, it took a mere 8 years to get it constructed, and it has been in operation for 11 years in 2 months. So that's kind of the history of how that got going. And now we're going to take a little bit of a look at an up-close view of it and exactly why in the world am I talking about plants today. Some of you might notice that this is the East Fork Wetland Project. The very first name was the East Fork Water Reuse. And nobody wanted to talk about raw water because the word raw doesn't sound very friendly. So they actually ended up changing it to the East Fork water reuse, but it's more commonly referred to as the East Fork Wetland Project. So depending on documentation or videos, you'll see all of those names being used. So when you look at this particular picture, you're going to see 175 is going right there from east to west. Here's the East Fork of the Trinity River, and the very northern aspect of the wetland project that you see is what's called the sedimentation basin. When the water is pulled off the Trinity River, it sits for about 24 hours. Now, some of you may be wondering, since John Bunker Sands was not able to get congressional approval to breach the Trinity River, how exactly did the North Texas Municipal Water District? It's because they did not breach the levees. They have an underground pipe that went underneath and is able to pull that water out without endangering the levees. So everybody that lives in the area is still quite protected from any overflooding from the river. After the water sits in the basins for about 24 hours, the first series of weirs or gates opens up, and then the water naturally flows from that northern section into the central section. Now, there are active engines that pull the water out to get it into the sedimentation basins, but once it gets to that sedimentation basin area, it's actually the natural grade of the land, and the water naturally flows. Once the water gets into that central section, it's going to go through a series of cells, which are called a train. And you can see the arrows of the topography of the land. Now, that water is going to flow through there for about 5 to 7 days, and it's going to collect in the deep water channel at the very bottom. Water assessments are done, testing, and it's all automatically sent back to the main waste treatment, water treatment plant in Wiley. Then when it gets down to the very southern portion of the central section, there's another set of weirs, and that water is then going to flood into the lower section on the very bottom. It's going to go through there for again another 5 to 6 days and collect at the deep water section down at the very southern end. You can see that little white square down there, and that is where we have our pump station. And at that point, 5 3,000 horsepower engines pump that water 43 miles north through an underground water pipe all the way back to the northern aspect of Lavon Lake. Amazingly enough, those 3,000 horsepower engines are able to propel that water all the way back to Lake Lavon in about 4.5 hours. So the main purpose of this entire man-made wetland project is the cleaning of the existing municipal water. It's a way of increasing the water access for the people and the businesses in the area without having to have another water source, because we're simply reusing the water. I'm going to flip back to the previous screen so you can see that really we're making a giant urban water cycle. We're using the water, we're flushing it, it's going into the waste treatment plant so that it's not drinkable by human beings, but it's no longer considered harmful to the environment. It flows into the creeks, goes into the river, goes to the wetland, runs through the wetland for approximately 2 weeks, that is piped back up into Lake Lavon, where it's going to sit for a number of months. And then at the southern aspect of Lavon Lake, that's where the water treatment plant is in Wiley. It's going to disinfect the water, ionize it, add fluoride for fun, and then transport all that water to all of the water towers, creating this giant reuse cycle. So it's a pretty fantastic way of increasing the water access to the businesses and the people without having to take the water from any other location. We're simply reusing our water. At this point, when I'm talking usually to high schoolers about this, they want to know if we're stealing water from Houston. And then I ask them if they mind, and none of them seem to mind it, but it is something that they're thinking about. We're not taking any water away from the water that would be flowing down the East Fork of the Trinity River, because we're simply reusing it over and over again. And they do have a series of water monitoring stations that measure the velocity and the depth of the water to make sure that not too much water is being removed by the water district. All right, so now you're probably all wondering, now that we know the history of what's going on, how long the wetland has been operating, which is 11 years. We'll be celebrating our 11th anniversary at the John Bunker Sands Wetland Center this October. You're wondering, what exactly is a wetland? And usually if I'm talking to high schoolers or middle schoolers or elementary school kids, I ask them the trick question is a wetland always wet? And it is not. It actually technically only has to have submerged saturated soils for approximately 2 weeks continuously in a growing cycle. But for those of us that really want a seriously accurate definition of a wetland is an area that is inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration that supports the prevalence of vegetation that is adapted for life in that saturated environment. Now, wetlands include swamps, marshes, bogs, and similar areas. And we're going to talk about this man-made wetland, exactly what kind of wetland it is, and it all depends on the plants. So when it comes to wetlands, the 4 main types of wetlands that I get to talk about all the time are swamps, marshes, bogs, and fens. Now, the easiest way to separate these 4 out, number 1, if you have lots of trees, you've got a swamp. And we always think about the swampy area around Caddo with beautiful cypress trees and the Spanish moss hanging out of it. If you've got lots of trees, you've got a swamp. However, if you've got a lot of grasses and most of the water is the result of seasonal flooding and tides and rains, then you're talking about a marsh. Now, bogs, which are one of my favorites, by the way, unlike the other 2, this is not a nutrient-rich area. You're going to see a lot of carnivorous plants. You're going to see a preponderance of peat. And really what you're going to have is a depression in the earth that is largely made of clay. So the water is sitting there, not a high nutritious area. And I had the opportunity to go to the Gus Engling wildlife management area and go see the bog there. And it really does feel like a really primordial area. I expected to see a pterodactyl flying over as I was looking at those giant sundew carnivorous plants. The last type of wetland that we have are fens. Fens are kind of that in between a bog and a marsh, in which, because there are cracks in that clay soil, you have the seepage of fresh water, so the nutrition is a lot better than a bog. So you're going to have a much greater plant diversity in a fen. However, if within a fen, some of the detritus ends up clogging up those water seepage areas, you all of a sudden can find yourself going from a fen to a bog. And unless there is significant human interaction and really interference, it's very hard for a bog to return to being a fen. So when we think about the man-made wetland that we have, which do you think it is? I mean, there's not a lot of, the only trees that we really have are trees that are on the edge habitat that honestly survive the process of being flooded. We know that it's constantly getting a source from a freshwater body of water, which is the Trinity River. So if you've decided that the East Fork Water Reuse Project is more of a man-made marsh, you would be correct. Every once in a while, though, when all the pigs wallow out and create a bizarre depression in some of our soil areas around it, they do create little mini bogs, which are pretty entertaining until the mosquitoes get so bad that they chase us away. But we have seen some interesting areas where it's so anaerobic that you kind of get yourself a little miniature bog there on the wetland. So now that we know exactly how we got this wetland and we know that it's a marsh style wetland, what are the benefits of whether it's a man-made wetland or a natural occurring wetland? And the number 1 benefit of any wetland is the reduction of water pollution, which we're going to be talking about. In addition to the reduction of water pollution, we have flood control. And most people really don't think about wetlands being primarily focused for flood control, but they are essential to flood control. I think that all of us in Texas have really seen a really good example of what happens to an area if the wetland areas are taken away. And that's if we look down into the area of Houston. They took some of their flood control areas, some of their natural wetlands, they covered them in concrete and built a lot of buildings on them. And now they have 100-year floods every 4 to 5 years. And they're actually actively restoring some of their wetlands within the Houston area. Closely related to flood control are going to be the next 2, which are your groundwater recharge and your erosion control. Clearly, if you have a shallow area that can hold a lot of water and let the water slowly seep through the ground, you're going to reduce the temperature of the water. You're going to reduce the velocity that the water is moving, and you're therefore naturally going to reduce the erosion that that water is going to produce. So wetlands are highly effective in reducing erosion. pollution. And then obviously with groundwater recharge, we have a lot of areas, especially, I mean, the whole country, wetlands are very useful for holding the water so that slowly the water can seep through that clay and that caliche to be able to refill the aquifers that are underneath. Now, the last two benefits, there are some man-made wetlands, I mean, also some of them are not very far from us at all, that are primarily built for wildlife habitat and recreation. The Chambers Wildlife Management Area, primarily built for wildlife habitat for waterfowl hunting. And a secondary impact is that it does actually reduce water pollution. However, the East Fork water reuse, the primary goal is that reduction of water pollution and really flood control and storage of water. And the secondary impact is that we do have wildlife habitat and recreation. About this point, I'll let you know that not only did I create this PowerPoint to give all of you, but every single one of the pictures, except for the maps and a couple of the cartoons, are photos that I have taken at the East Fork Water Reuse Project. And so I did catch these gulls having quite a lovely afternoon and thought, well, absolutely, wildlife habitat and recreation. That day, I think the birds were having more recreation than me. All right, we've all seen this fantastic picture of upland prairie plants with their glorious long roots searching for moisture, although there's been more and more studies out here lately that are showing that those roots may be doing more than just searching for water. But these roots are mainly going through an pretty impervious surface, trying to punch out some air holes where they can expand out, always on the search for water. However, when we're talking about the plants that are residing at the wetland, root structure is quite different. Now, these are some photographs that I took of a cattail that I put into a glass jar so that we can kind of get an idea of what these look like. And instead of those beautiful, long, hair-like roots, we really do see a bit of a thick, stubby. I kind of think that they look a little bit like iris tubers. I have a lot of my students that tell me that they look like skinny, weird carrots. And I tell them that the reason why these things look kind of odd is because we're not looking at roots, we're looking at rhizomes. Now, we all know if you have a rhizome, that means that not only can roots and rootlets shoot off of it, but also additional plants can come off of it. And I can see a couple of these where it looks like there's a new plant that is going to be growing off of it. But when we talk about these rhizomes, rhizomes are critical to the entire water cleaning experience that is going on at the East Fork Water Reuse Project. I kind of like my picture on the left because not only did I get a rhizome there, but I actually washed the nasty water and the hydric soil off there to actually get some of the rootlets. In just a second, you're going to see I then grabbed my microscope so we could actually see the rootlets and the ciliary hairs. And that's the next picture. So you really get an idea that this is actually one of those small rootlets. And now you're actually seeing the really, really tiny ciliary hairs that are branching off of that. And these ciliary hairs, this is where all the activity is going on at the Wetland Center. This is where all the oxygen exchange is going on. This is where all of the nutrient uptake is going on. And if you happen to be a microinvertebrate, this is also where you're going to be hanging around because you love oxygen. And we're going to talk about how these plants are really primarily out there to help these macroinvertebrates have access to oxygen. All right, so here's my classic cartoon of a cattail sitting inside one of the cells. We've got that nasty hydric soil underneath it. Nothing really good is going on about that soil. It doesn't have any access to oxygen because there's water on top of it all the time. The only type of any remotely material that would be useful would be the detritus from some of the plants that fall over. You can see that I've got that nice little cartoon of a rhizome going across with a little shoot coming up for another cattail, and we've got the little rootlets. Now, we're going to talk about nutrients because these plants are here because of the nutrients. But when we use the word nutrients, that's nutrients to the plants, but that's pollutants to us. When we talk about the pollutants that these plants are removing, the two main ones we talk about are nitrates and phosphates. Nitrates are a breakdown from our liquid and solid waste because one of the most nasty things about our waste is the ammonia. So remember back when we talked about the waste treatment plant, they're going to break down our solid and liquid waste so that it's no longer ammonia, but has nitrates. And those nitrates are going to be released back into the water. They're definitely harmful to us, but they're not harmful to the environment. The other nutrient or pollutant, depending on your perspective, that we talk a lot about are the phosphates. Now, if I was giving this presentation in Kansas or Iowa, I would be telling you that the majority of the nitrates and the phosphates are from fertilizer runoff. However, in incredible population dense areas like the DFW Metroplex, we humans are the main source of the nitrates and the phosphates. Nitrates from liquid waste from our body and phosphates from our absolute affection for soapy products and things that suds up. So they break down the soaps into phosphates. So the two main things we think about are the nitrates and the phosphates that are really heavy in the water, and those are the things that the plants are going to take up, because unlike us that think that those are pollutants, those are nutrients. The area that the rootlets are anchored into is called the rhizosphere, and the rhizosphere includes the rhizome itself, the hydric soil it's anchored in, and the water that is just above that soil level. Now, unlike all of our upland prairie plants, the stems of these water plants or hydrophytes have a structure called a parenchyma. And a parenchyma, interestingly, is the organic inspiration for cardboard. So these particular structures have a real enveloped shape. Not only are they fantastic about letting the plant transport gases up and down the stem, they also give the plants the amazing ability to bend in the wind and not break. So oxygen, whenever these plants perform photosynthesis, just like any of our upland prairie plants or even our cypress trees that are just on the edge of the wetland, they produce photosynthesis. They take carbon dioxide out of the air, and they do produce a waste product to the plant's point of view called oxygen. But instead of releasing oxygen out into the atmosphere like those cypress trees do, these hydrophytes transport that oxygen down into the rhizosphere. Now, you're probably wondering why they would go to the effort to do that, and that is because by sending oxygen down into the atmosphere, they concentrate bacteria around that rhizosphere, and that bacteria is a partnership that helps them get the nutrients they need. So here's my plant. And the first thing that we're going to have is the plant is going to send oxygen down into the very edge of those rootlets to those ciliary hairs. And the oxygen is actually going to be released right in between the interstitial spaces. So now there's all this oxygen bubbling around that rhizosphere, and that makes all the bacteria hang around there. And because the bacteria are there, they clump and stick to the nitrates and the phosphates and the other nutrients that are in the water. And they actually pull those nutrients down lower into the water column where it's easier for the plant to take up. We call that process phytostabilization. Phyto meaning plant, and stabilize, we're just stabilizing those chemicals where the plant has an easier time taking them up. The next thing that happens is phytoextraction, and that is the process by which the plant can actually take those chemical impurities or nutrients and draws them into the same ciliary hairs through an ion exchange, because when they release the oxygen, now those chemicals have an ion ability to travel into the plant. So the plant actually removes those nutrients from the water. Like all living things, that plant then degrades those chemicals down into products that they can use, and they then have leftover products that they cannot use. Now, depending on the type of chemical that the plant is breaking down, sometimes the plants are able to break it down all the way into an inert gas in the form of the nitrate cycle, and they break it all the way down into inert nitrous gas, and they release it into a process called phytovolatilization. By the way, this is one of my favorite words I get to use. I tell all of the high school students that go by, you need to take phytovolatilization and put it in your back pocket. And anytime anybody asks you a really, really good question about what's on your mind, just tell them you're just wondering if the plants have a high rate enough of phytovolatilization to reduce the nitrogen in the reuse project at the Wetland Center. And I'm sure at that point they'll impress all sorts of people. So that's always a word to keep in your back pocket. Unfortunately, when plants are breaking down the phosphate, they cannot phytovolatilize phosphate. And so they have to sequester it in one of two places, their stems, or they actually can send it back down through the parenchyma into the rhizosphere and put it into the soil. Now, if they do sequester that phosphate into their leaves, we kind of have a problem, especially when you have a winter where it gets down to 0 degrees and all of the cattails flop over dead into the water. What do? Otherwise, the phosphate gets returned back into the water. And that's why the North Texas Municipal Water District does prescribe burns in December and January to burn up those leaves and release the phosphate byproducts into the atmosphere. If there is phosphate that is sequestered into the ground, that is why the North Texas Municipal Water District has all sorts of engaging methods to reduce the more destructive fish that we have that stir up the water. The main fish that does this is actually an invasive form of carp. And the way that the water district handles that is they actually drain all the water out of the cell. The water gets very low. All of these huge carp flop around, and every pelican in the area seems to know that it's sushi night in Seagaville, and they swoop down, they eat all of the carp, and as soon as there's nothing but skeleton bones left, then the water district floods the water back in, and that's how they naturally keep the carp from stirring up the phosphate that's been sequestered into the soil. When we take phytostabilization, phytoextraction, phytodegradation, and phytovolatilization all together, that process overall is called phytoremediation. Phyto meaning plant, and remediate meaning to bring balance. So this whole process of phytoremediation is simply plants doing what they do, which is to take the nutrients they need, and by doing that, they are naturally restoring the water to a cleaner state, which is really convenient for us because we can't uptake nitrates and phosphates ourselves. Now, when it comes to the type of plants that we have at the East Fork Water Reuse Project, there are 3 types: the submerged, the floating, and the emergent. Now, as we go through all of these specific plants, all of these plants do their duty to do phytoremediation. So when we talk about their role, just keep in mind that this is on top of the amazing ability that they have to clean our municipal water. So let's dive in with some of my favorite plants that I get to see every day at the wetland. So first of all, we're going to talk about coontail. Scientific name is Ceratophyllum demersum. You might also hear it's called hornwort or rigid hornwort. Very much colloquial whether you hear coontail or coon's tail. In addition to cleaning the water, coontail provides a fantastic cover for our fish fry, and it's a fantastic habitat for many of our aquatic macroinvertebrates. Also, it is a fabulous food source for all of our waterfowl. Coontail is found on every continent of the planet except for Antarctica. And unlike some of the other plants we'll talk about, it is a lovely plant for you to have in your home wetland, or your home, if you got a lot of property wetland, or a home pond. They're really, really easy to cultivate, and they're not an aggressive grower. So let's take a closer look at coontail. I absolutely love coontail. I think it's absolutely beautiful. You can see the upper left, it ranges in colors, everything from a limey green all the way to almost a beautiful maroon brown, depending on the season. This particular year, the weather pattern has been really interesting, that the coontail has really formed an underwater forest. It's quite thick. And as you can see on the right, the water is 2.5 feet deep, and it's a lush, thick forest. Normally, it's much more sparse. On the lower left picture, the coontail is actually so thick that some of our larger species of fish, including the spotted gar and the bullhead catfish, they have actually created little substreams within the coontail. So if you haven't been to the wetland to see it, it's quite an experience to go out on a solid body of water, which is a cell within a man-made wetland, and actually convince yourself that there's a stream of fresh water that doesn't have coontail in the middle of the cell. So it's quite lovely to watch. Now we're going to talk about duckweed, and I picked this picture on purpose because when you look at it to the left, my little picture on the left, you see what almost looks like a little floret-shaped green plant. That is not the duckweed. That's actually mosquito fern. The tiny little bitty plant that's kind of greenish white in between, that is the duckweed. That's how small it is. The species that we have there, and we have a couple of them, all reside in the Limnaeidae family. They're also known as water lentils or water lenses. And these particular plants are quite unique. It's a very, very simple structure. Oftentimes they actually lack a stem, and they can actually lack leaves, and many of them lack roots. Some of them will have a tiny little bitty rootlet, and we'll take a look at those in just a second. Each plant is a small organized thallus or a frond with a little parenchyma pocket, and that little pocket of air is what allows these tiny little plants to float. Just kind of a sideline, just because I love little small trivial things about plants. The genus Wolfia has the smallest flower on the planet at only 0.3 millimeters, tiny, tiny. All right, so let's look at some of my pictures of the duckweed. On the left, that is a serious magnification. Whenever I put those three little specific fronds under the microscope, my naked eye, I couldn't even see those tiny rootlets. Now let's talk about the two pictures on the one on the right and on the bottom. This is my favorite role that duckweed plays at the wetland. Not only does it clean the water, it acts as an awesome kind of an aquatic 1970s shag carpet for some of the aquatic creatures that like to run around the water. So we've got a beautiful six-spotted fishing spider that is actually using the duckweed to run around and hunt on. And then we've got ourselves an eastern pondhawk there that is hanging out on the duckweed and using it as a convenient launch pad to try to chase down something to eat. So duckweed, absolutely amazing plant, cleans the water and also provides a lot of surface area for the macroinvertebrates to hang out at. Now we're going to talk about pondweed. Pondweed, I think, has an absolutely amazing name source. It's Potamogeton, and that is Greek from the word river, Potamos, and geton, which is neighbor. So really their name is river neighbor. And what more could you have a plant that has a name of river neighbor? It is found worldwide due to the more temperate climate. It tends to have a greater species diversity in the northern hemisphere. And these particular plants, in addition to cleaning the water, they are fabulous as rafts for mating, egg depositing, and for hunting. So let's take a look at pondweed. As you can see here, the root structures are much, much larger, and the surface area of the leaves themselves is much larger. So you can imagine, compared to the duckweed, pondweed is a much better phytoremediator. It does tend to clump together, and it does create a really good surface also for some of the other algae and other plant structures to hang on to. Oftentimes, they'll kind of act as a corral to keep duckweed in a small area, and the macroinvertebrates just absolutely love hanging out on it. It's some of the leaves get so large that I'll see small snakes hanging out on top of them. They'll use them as floaties during the summer. All right, let's talk about American water lotus, Nelumbo lutii. It's also called American lotus. You might hear yellow lotus. You might hear water chinkapin and volée. It is native to North America. In addition to being a stupendous water remediator, pulling out phosphates and nitrates, everything about this plant has an edible quality. The tuberous rhizome is edible, and if you actually take the seeds and you dry them, they're well known in indigenous people as alligator corn. So it does an excellent job of phytoremediating. You really see much larger leaf structure. The larger the leaf structure is, the more photosynthesis it can perform, and the greater amount of photosynthesis it performs, the greater amount of nutrient uptake it can do in that trade. And it really does provide an incredible amount of oxygen to the macroinvertebrates that live below. So here's some pictures that I took just this summer. Actually, a couple of these pictures are quite new of the American water lotus. It's one of the plants I always wish that we could have painters come out and paint the American water lotus because it is so beautiful. It's also really good for attracting a lot of our pollinators. So get to see a lot of plant variety. Unlike all the other plants, their blooming time is very, very short. So pretty much from the bottom half of June until about a week from now is peak bloom time for the American water lotus. Then all of the seed heads are going to turn brown, and the entire area looks like it's full of rusty shower heads. Not exactly pretty, but even though the seed heads turn completely brown, those large flat water lotus leaves still do an incredible job of cleaning the water, even not during their blooming time. Floating primrose willow. Out of all the plants that I'm going to talk about, this is the least desired. It's called Ludwigia pabloides. It's also known as primrose willow, and you also might hear it called creeping water primrose. It is native to the North and South Americas. It is well known as a noxious weed, and it does invade water ecosystems, and it can clog waterways. The entire country of France nominated it to be the most annoying and aggravating and unwanted aquatic plant. How about that, France? So it can be a bit of a trouble there as far as clogging waterways, but at the wetland, it does do an excellent job of phytoremediating. So it is actively cultivated as well. And you can see from my perspective, it's not only a great phytoremediator, but it's an excellent perch for darners to do a lot of mating. So you'll see ovipositing going on a lot, and that beautiful little eastern amberwing hanging up there, trying to see whether they can find somebody to mate with or somebody to eat. I think dragonflies really don't care which happens on any given day, but they are very, very grateful for these fantastic aquatic plants that provide so many different purposes of the wetland. Now we're going to switch from the floating plants and the submerged plants, and we're going to talk about the emergent plants. And remember, these are plants that have their rhizomes anchored into the hydric soil. Part of their structure is underwater, but the major portion of the plant is out of the water. It has those green leaves, it's performing photosynthesis, and unlike the submerged plants, these plants do not need the water to be as clear for them to perform photosynthesis. Remember, we talked about that the water district actually tries to control the turbidity of the water using the draining of the system to get rid of the carp. All of the emergent plants, they're perfectly happy if the water is cloudy because they can still perform all their photosynthesis because they don't need the sunlight to penetrate the water. So pickerel weed, named after the pickerel fish or the pike, is Pontandaria cordata. It is native to the American continents, and much like the coontail, this one is an excellent plant for your garden pond to really keep the water clear and to reduce any of the waste that you have from any of your fish. My perspective, the best thing pickerel weed offers as a role at the wetland is it's an excellent launch pad for bumblebees. Bumblebees are underwinged and overbody weighted, and so they do need to have a particular source of pollen that's really stout that they can land on without bending the plant over. And so bumblebees love pickerel weed. Here's a couple of pictures that I actually took just this past week of pickerel weed. As you can see, the leaves are very large and very, very thick stalks. So with those very thick stalks, you're going to have an incredible amount of parenchyma. And that tells you right now that these plants do an incredible job of transporting those chemicals, those nutrients, gases from the leaves to the stems down into the rhizosphere, and then also out to phytovolatilize the chemicals that they can break all the way down into an inert gas. I had quite a bit of fun watching the dragonfly and the tree frog over here hang out on that leaf. You can't tell because I couldn't get the picture in, but they were actually watching a male Argiopia aurantia spider attempt to convince the female not to eat him during mating, but it didn't go so well. So always good things to watch, and it's really wonderful to see these plants provide such multiple purposes for not only for us in the water cleaning, edibility for some of the waterfowl, but also for breeding habitat for all of the macroinvertebrates. All right, let's talk about swamp smartweed, Polygonum hydropiporoides. This is something I did not know until I was researching for this presentation, is that's actually a flowering plant in the buckwheat family. As soon as I learned that, I looked at it and of course this looks like buckwheat. Never thought about it before then. Commonly also known as false water pepper. It's native to North and South America, and it can grow up to a height of almost 4 feet. The spike-like inflorescences produce little pinkish flowers, but you have to be there right after the bloom to see pink because it fades immediately to white. So there's a lot of people that have said, I don't think swamp smartweed has pink flowers, and that's because it turns white quite quickly. And here's some beautiful pictures of the swampweed. Again, another fantastic phytoremediator. It tends to not be in the depths of the water, but right on the edges, and it tends to blend really well and lies right mixed in with all of that pickerel weed that we talked about. Interestingly enough, all of the bees love swamp smartweed, but the wasps really enjoy the swamp smart. So always be careful when you're looking in your smartweed to make sure you don't put your hands on it, because I've had more than one sting from wasps that thought the smartweed was as amazing as I thought it was when trying to get some pictures. All right, now we're going to talk about the workhorse of the wetland, and that is giant bulrush. Shown Plectus californicus, also known as the California bulrush or the southern bulrush. It is native to the South and Western United States and Central South America. And this is the most highly cultivated populous hydrophyte that we have at the East Fork Water Reuse Project. It is an incredibly efficient phytoremediator. And the other thing it does is it's actually year-round. Good portions of it were still completely green all the way during February when it was 0 degrees and the water was actually frozen at the wetland. And you can see from this picture, this really gives the idea, unlike some of the other plants, these have distinct rows. And if you have footage from above, you can really see that these actually are farmed. And this is the primary plant that they do put in. It clusters together very well. And they do the burnings on this plant as well during December and January, just to reduce the thatch to encourage fresh new growth, because we want the most concentration of this plant because it is a superior phytoremediator and does an excellent job of cleaning the water. So you're going to see it in the majority of the central section, and in the more southern aspects of the southern section. You're not going to see it quite as much around the central section where we have the boardwalk, and that's because there's a mixture of little islands for wildlife, and those particular areas are surrounded by the pickerel weed and some of the other weeds that we're going to discuss as we keep going. Interestingly enough, about giant bulrush is that in other countries, it's actually farmed for its structure. Many indigenous people have been building boats from the sedges for thousands of years. So there are still countries that actually, let me admit somebody real quick, that actually farm this particular plant, not as a phytoremediator, but to still gather the sedges and make boats out of them. So many purposes. All right, duck potato arrowhead, Sagittaria latifolia. It's also known as your broadleaf arrowhead, your duck potato, Indian potato, Katniss, or Wapato. It is native to quite a large area, southern Canada, all of the United States, Mexico, and going all the way into South America. The unique thing about this particular plant is, above all the other plants, it has an affinity for really high levels of phosphates and does well in much harder water environments. So it definitely is cultivated here. It is the second most populous cultivated plant after the giant bulrush. And it's also quite attractive. It is amazing because of all the skills that it has. Not only is it a fantastic phytoremediator and above all else can really deal with the high levels of phosphates, but the entire plant is edible from top to bottom. The tubers can be eaten raw. They're also really good if you roast them or fry them. You can also completely dry them and turn them to grain. And we have made duck potato pancakes for kids out at the wetland, and taste a little bit like cornmeal. In addition, the flower buds and the fruit are edible. So this plant was highly cultivated by indigenous peoples in this area. It not only kept their water sources clean, but was also a food source and a textile source as well. Now, unlike all the other plants, I don't have as many pictures of the duck potato arrowhead because unfortunately, it's also not as good of a competitor as some of the other plants. And unless the water district actively plants it and kind of watches out for it, the cattails can kind of outcompete it. So it's not as easily seen. There's little pockets of it around the wetland that you have to go look for. Delta arrowhead, Sagittaria platyphylla, also known as the Delta arrowhead, broadleaf arrowhead, or Delta duck potato, just to confuse you. If you come out to the East Fork Water Reuse, you're mostly going to see the Delta arrowhead. You have to kind of like find little patches of the duck potato. Unlike the duck potato, however, the Delta arrowhead does not have as big of a range. It's native to the eastern United States, from Texas all the way up through the Florida Panhandle, but it only goes as north as South Illinois. It reproduces by stolons and seeds. And it just happens to be one of my favorite plants. We have a beautiful, a huge crop of it just to the left when you enter the boardwalk. I happen to like that area because lots of native green tree frogs hang out in the Delta arrowhead, as do our adorable little ribbon snakes. And a lot of the spiders, they actually use the really reinforced rib of the leaves to build their webs. So this particular plant is a fantastic phytoremediator. It's a very thick stalk, a very wet and parenchyma structure. When you snap the leaf off, it almost weeps fluid like an aloe vera plant, and you can really see the large parenchyma structure in it. So it's a really good one to show students for anatomy for the Arinkema. It has beautiful blooms that attract all sorts of pollinators. And like I said, it attracts lots of frogs and insects and snakes. So it's a particular plant you don't want to miss. It has so many wonderful uses in addition to just being a phytoremediator. It's an excellent habitat source. And last, let's talk about cattail, Typha domingensis, also known as the southern cattail or kumbunji. It is found throughout the temperate and tropical regions. And its claim to fame is that it is effective at reducing bacterial contamination of water for agricultural uses for up to 98%. This is why when you see a large pond in an area that has both agriculture and has cattle, that the cattails do a beautiful job of actually taking up that bacterial contamination of the water. So between the cattail having an ability to really focus on bacterial contamination, the arrowheads that are really dealing with the high phosphates, and the giant bulrush that is just a year-round phytoremediator, these three really act as a core of plants that do so well. Interestingly enough, though, the cattails, there are several other cattail species at the East Fork Water Reuse Project because it's such a great habitat. Cattails do reproduce by those little free-floating fluff we see everywhere, and so we have multiple species of cattail, but the only one that's actually planted and cultivated by the Water District is the Typha domingensis. The rest of them are just natural immigrants to the area. And I absolutely love cattail for one reason and one reason only, because it's the primary food source for the Henry's marsh moth caterpillar, which is up in the upper right. We're already past the marsh moth season for this year, but it's wonderful to come to the wetland in the spring, go out about 10 o'clock in the morning, be completely quiet. And there are millions of these caterpillars, so many of them that you can hear that as they're all eating. It's absolutely fabulous. We're not quite ready for what I call the cattail snow season, and that's when they're all going to be going to seed. And then there's cattail fluff everywhere. So if you have allergies to it, be forewarned. You should call us and ask us if it's snowing that day. But otherwise, the cattail fluff, it really does look like it is snowing at the wetland. The last great, I think, use of cattails, and you can see down the bottom, is they are fantastic purchase for all of the dragonflies to hold on with their front couple of legs and obelisk, put their bodies up into the air to ventilate themselves, to prevent themselves from overheating. You can see a couple of them. There's one in that lower left there that's doing a beautiful obelisk. So this particular plant is not only a food source for the caterpillars, it's not only cleaning out the bacterial loads that are in the water, but also it is a fantastic plant habitat for all of the macroinvertebrates. In addition, cattail is a bit like the potato arrowhead. It has incredible sources as far as human uses. The tubers are edible. The seed heads, before they go to fluff, are actually have an antibacterial quality, and the indigenous peoples actually use them as toothbrushes. The fluff is used in textile purposes, and many of the indigenous tribes that were in the area would create weavings, and they also made their roofs for their thatch homes out of the cattail reeds. So an incredibly useful plant, in addition to the phytoremediating properties that it gives the wetland. So I know I've gone over a lot of things, but just kind of a sum up as to why I think that these beautiful plants are such critical members of the water reuse ecosystem. They phytoremediate municipal water by taking out the chemicals that we can't tolerate in our water, taking them out and using them for their own structures. They're a fantastic food source for waterfowl. They are a habitat for macroinvertebrates. Many of them are edible by a lot of the wildlife. I got to tell you, the nutria absolutely love eating the cattail base of the stems just above the tuber, which is actually why the North Texas Municipal Water District hunts the nutria, because the nutria are always nibbling on the base of those hydrophytes. Many of them are edible to human beings, and many of them have textiles and other applications for human beings separate of the phytoremediation. So I hope this was a nice review of the plants that we have here, a little bit of history of the wetland and exactly how the plants are involved. I'm going to switch back to not sharing my screen while we're taking any questions. So I just want to say thank you for looking at all of my pictures that I took at the wetland recently, and I will switch back to not sharing my screen if I can figure out how to do that.
Carol, that was awesome. Thank you so much. We have just a few questions so far. Everybody put your questions in chat, and we will get to them. Reba would like to know, in rainy years, when Lake Lavon level is high, is the Trinity River water intake restricted for JBS phytoremediation?
That is a great question. Absolutely. If you recall back in September of 2018, when it started raining, and it didn't stop raining until basically February of 2019, Lake Lavon was at full capacity. And so no water could be transported from the wetland up to Lake Lavon. Not only could you not transport the water from the wetland to Lake Lavon, we could not open up the pipe to the river, because the river was actually higher and at higher capacity than the East Fork water reuse. And if they had opened up the pipes to just put the water to let it continue to go on down, unfortunately, the Trinity River would have backed up into the wetland and flooded us. And so during that time, the water did not move, and the mosquitoes were almost large enough to carry a woman my size away. It was the roughest 3 months of employment there because the mosquitoes were horrendous. So yes, and we're glad the water's flowing and the Lavon Lake is not at capacity right now.
Cool. Jim would like to know, is there no water hyacinth there?
Is there no water hyacinth? No.
Okay.
Well, I don't know how to make that better. No, there's not any water hyacinth that is cultivated. Have I gone by and seen little patches of it? Yes. And that anything like that is there, that is really transported via the birds that are wading in the water, get little bits of the plants on their legs, and then transport it by flying from one area to another, but it is not cultivated there.
Okay. Compliment, 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 compliment. Compliment. In the talks I heard in the earlier days of John Bunker Sands Wetland Center, it was mentioned that water only came into the wetlands when the river reached a certain level. Is that still true? And has the level ever been too low?
That's a great question. There are multiple monitoring stations of the water depth and velocity at the East Fork of the Trinity River before it's diverted into the pump station, and then also after it's released back out, and also the volume of the water when it goes to Lake Lavon. So they do have parameters to where too much water cannot be taken out. There has not been a situation in which the Trinity River has been so low that the water flow was reduced going through the wetland, but that is a possibility, that if the water was too low, then the water would not be able to be pulled out, because what you can't do is pull so much water out that you impact the water flow south of the wetland and where it connects to the main stem. And that being said, the water flow has never been low enough for them to do that. That is a matter of fact. 2 years ago, an expansion connection was put in at the actual main stem, and that water is being added to the wetland. And now, instead of a max of 65 million gallons a day, it now is going to be over 90 million gallons a day. Good question.
Thank you, Janet. Compliment, compliment, compliment. Janice would like to know, can the general public be present during a prescribed burn or when the water levels are reduced to get rid of the carp?
Absolutely. I actually, one of my favorite homeschool classes that I taught was we actually took all the kids out and we let them catch the wetland on fire in front of us. And the kids were just amazed. So absolutely. During December and January, the North Texas Municipal Water District does post on their website if they are doing prescribed burns. And the reason why is that the smoke is quite thick and nasty when the giant bulrush and the cattails are burning. So they do have to put out signs to warn anybody that has any respiratory complications to make sure they stay inside. It's really quite interesting, prescribed burns, because unlike a prescribed burn of a forest where the wind can't be a certain speed, you have to have wind speeds of at least 12 to 15 miles an hour, or the water puts the fire out because you're trying to catch a wetland on fire. They also have to make sure that the wind is blowing away from 175, because you can't have black thick smoke blowing onto 175 and causing motor vehicle accidents. So absolutely, the public can come to see prescribed burns. I've never really thought about it until now, but since I'm also in charge of a lot of social media, I probably should tell people when there's a prescribed burn, because I think people might want to see it. It's really fascinating because the flames are just intensely orange, and the smoke is really thick and black. As far as draining the cells, absolutely. We usually try to let people know that that when we are lowering the cells, because all of a sudden we have all of our short-legged wading birds that come into the area, and there are a lot of birders that definitely like to be notified, because instead of just seeing great egrets and great blue herons, all of a sudden we've got little sandpipers running around and all sorts of blackneck stilts. It's quite fun. And so we do try to let everybody know when the water levels are low so that they can see all of the short-legged wading birds. And there's nothing more fun than watching a bunch of pelicans pick apart invasive carp, to tell you the truth.
Peter says, excellent presentation. What fork of the Trinity that what is the fork of the Trinity that flows past downtown? East Fork, right?
And no, East Fork is what runs to the east side of the Metroplex, branching all the way up from McKinney. The main stem is what actually flows through Dallas.
Okay.
Elm Fork and the West Fork are higher up, but the main fork, that's the main stem, the main fork that goes through Dallas, is actually referred to as the main stem.
Love the photography, incredible presentation, wonderful job. It's good to see you again. Who can you repeat who announces the burns?
Yeah, it would be me, actually. Two ways to do it. If you go to the North Texas Municipal Water District website, they always do an article in December talking about the prescribed burns, and they usually put on there the days they're doing it. They have kind of like a little pop-up screen that'll tell you that. Otherwise, you can always call JBS Tuesday through Saturdays and ask us if they're doing prescribed burns, and we're more than happy to tell you, because we do have some people with respiratory concerns that during December and January they call because they don't want to be there during a burn.
This is awesome. Would definitely like to see the pelicans feast on that carp. The burns would be great on Facebook Live.
Oh, that's a really good idea. I should go out there with my camera and just be like, and we've caught the wetland on fire. It's a really good idea. I'll put that in my things to do list this winter.
Are these announcements also made on the website?
The lowering of the cells is not, and I have to tell you, oftentimes that's me going out there, or anybody else that works there, and just seeing it. They actually don't even announce to us that they're doing it. I just look out there and go, oh wow, that is a sandbar. I should head out there and see what's going on. So they don't publish when they're lowering the water cells, but they do publish with the prescribed birds.
Hint, hint, hint. And I think the last question we have so far is, do the bald eagles fish directly from the JBS cells?
That's a really great question. Generally, the bald eagles that live on property, they catch fish wherever they want to. I have seen them fish from actual cells at the wetland, but they are actually more common to do a bit of fishing actually on the East Fork of the Trinity River out past Bunkers Pond. I've seen them on multiple times fishing from that river along with the kingfishers, but we have had multiple pictures of people that have actually seen them fish from the cells.
And I think Ben Sandifer's published several of them at White Rock, the actual lake.
Mm-hmm.
And another excellent program. Compliment.
Lovely, thank you.
If anybody else has any questions, go ahead and unmute yourself so we can speed it up just a little bit and let Carol go. But otherwise, thank you so much, Carol. This was awesome. It was a pleasure to have you today.
Well, thank you so much. The last thing I'll let you know is that we are open Tuesday through Saturdays, and we're open every Saturday. For a long time, we were only open first and third Saturdays. And so we're open every Saturday from 7 a.m. until 4 p.m. The other thing to let you know is starting in September, we'll be returning to doing our Before the S'mores series, which is sometimes on the second, sometimes the third Friday of the month, usually the second or the fourth though, Friday of the month, where we are opening the center from 6 to 9 p.m. We have a featured speaker, we do s'mores and a guided boardwalk at sunset. So look out for that on our website as well. Oh, and the last thing, my husband just reminded me, and we're having our 11th, we're having our Wings Over the Wetland, big fundraiser that is going to all of the annual expenses, including my salary. So it's a big deal to me to have a fundraiser supporting the educational staff, and look for that because that is on October the 23rd. October the 23rd.
Sweet. Well, thanks everyone.